The gala marking 40 years of Whitmore emergency mobility glittered with wealth that made ordinary men invisible, and Owen Hale, safety supervisor, single father, stood near the back in a borrowed suit, there to oversee the display vehicles outside, nothing more. But when Evelyn Whitmore's face went slack on stage, her arm dropping limp and her words dissolving mid-sentence, Owen moved without hesitation. He recognized the signs, called for help, and kept her stable until paramedics arrived. 3 days later, Celeste Whitmore summoned him to a boardroom, and her mother walked in behind her, placed a sealed file on the table, and said something that left her own daughter unable to speak. If you believe genuine goodness can shift the balance of power, stay with Owen through every turn of this fight. The Whitmore 40th Anniversary Gala filled the Grand Meridian Hotel's largest ballroom with 200 guests who had not arrived by accident. Investors who moved markets, city officials who shaped contracts, medical industry leaders who decided which equipment saved lives and which gathered dust. All of them gathered beneath chandeliers that cost more than Owen Hale earned in 3 years. Owen moved along the perimeter of the room with the careful, unhurried gait of someone who belonged to the infrastructure of the evening rather than its spectacle, checking in through earpiece with the 2 drivers stationed in the loading circle outside, making sure the Whitmore demonstration vehicles were positioned correctly for the morning press walk. His badge said Safety, Fleet Operations in block letters, and it worked the way low-ranking badges always do. It rendered him functionally invisible to people who measured their worth in corner offices and committee seats. He had worn a suit borrowed from his neighbor because Rowan had told him over the phone that he could not walk into a room full of billionaires in a polo shirt, and he had laughed and said he was not walking into a room full of billionaires. He was parking vehicles outside one. Celeste Whitmore took the podium at 9 o'clock, with the composed authority of someone who had spent 2 decades proving she deserved to stand exactly there, and she described the journey of Whitmore Emergency Mobility, from its founding in a converted warehouse on the south side of Bellwether to the billion-dollar institution it had become, using the word legacy 11 times in 14 minutes, with the precision of someone who understood that repetition builds belief. She spoke about Aegis One, the autonomous emergency vehicle the company was preparing to launch, as the logical culmination of everything her family had worked to build. A machine that could respond faster than human hesitation, navigate without human error, and arrive when seconds were the difference between a life saved and a life lost. The audience responded with the kind of applause that comes not from sentiment but from the recognition of profit, because the government contract riding on Aegis One was valued at $4 billion, and everyone in that room understood what $4 billion meant for their portfolios. Evelyn Whitmore stepped to the edge of the stage when her daughter gestured toward her, and the applause renewed itself for the elegant 71-year-old woman who had turned personal grief into institutional greatness, or so every official biography said. She raised her glass to acknowledge the room, and then something shifted. Her expression changed not dramatically but in the specific, subtle way that Owen had learned to recognize years before, when he was still employed as a field paramedic, and every shift began with the knowledge that the difference between a good outcome and a devastating one often came down to the first person in the room who noticed. Her mouth pulled to one side, her glass tilted. Her free hand lost its grip, and her knees buckled with the boneless, surrendering quality of a body no longer receiving the instructions it was supposed to follow. The room responded with the noise of a crowd that does not know what it is seeing. A murmur of concern edged with embarrassment, the polite uncertainty of people trained to treat any social disruption as a potential overreaction. A communications aide moved to Evelyn's side and spoke quietly about bringing her somewhere private, away from cameras and Gideon Blackwell, who had been standing near the stage with his arms folded and his attention divided between the room and his phone, said something low and deliberate toward the nearest event staffer rather than toward any medical personnel. Owen was already moving before Gideon finished his sentence. He crouched beside Evelyn, spoke her name clearly, noted that her left arm was unresponsive, checked the time on his watch and committed it to memory, and told the aide standing above him to call emergency services immediately. Gideon stepped forward and said that the family had a private medical team on the way and that a public emergency call would create a media event that served no one. Owen did not raise his voice. He said that stroke damage is measured in minutes, that each minute without intervention corresponds to roughly 1.9 million neurons lost, and that the question was not what an emergency call might look like in the morning news, but whether Evelyn Whitmore would still be able to hold a conversation tomorrow. Celeste was 3 feet away, watching the exchange, and she gave one short nod. The call went through. Owen stayed at Evelyn's side, keeping her calm, preventing anyone from giving her food or water or unsolicited medication, tracking the time from symptom onset, with the methodical discipline of someone who had done this in far worse conditions than a hotel ballroom. The paramedics arrived in 7 minutes. As they lifted Evelyn onto the gurney and the crowd parted, she turned her head and found Owen's face with her eyes, looked at the badge on his lapel, and with a voice weakened but deliberate, formed a single question. She asked whether he was connected to a Daniel Hale. Owen opened his mouth and the ambulance doors closed. Across the room, Gideon Blackwell watched the doors seal and told the person on the other end of his phone to pull every personnel file associated with the name Owen Hale before morning. The hospital released a statement the following morning that credited Whitmore's in-house medical coordination team for the rapid response that had preserved Evelyn's condition, and the statement was accurate in every way that could be verified and misleading in every way that mattered. Owen's name appeared in no press release, no internal memo shared with the communications department, and no message of acknowledgement from the executive floor. He learned about the statement the same way he learned most things about the company he worked for, by overhearing it in the parking structure while checking tire pressure on a fleet vehicle before the morning dispatch. Gideon summoned him to the operations suite on the 51st floor 2 days after the gala, and the meeting lasted 9 minutes, during which Gideon informed Owen that his conduct at the event had violated the emergency protocol procedure for non-medical contractors, that his decision to intervene without authorization had exposed the company to liability, and that his behavior, speaking over a senior executive and creating disorder during a sensitive moment, had been flagged by 3 attendees whose accounts had been documented and submitted to the Internal Review Office. Owen asked which 3 attendees. Gideon said that was not relevant. The security access on Owen's badge was suspended before he reached the ground floor elevator. He walked home because the bus route was slower on Tuesdays, and Rowan called him before he made it 4 blocks, her voice carrying the particular controlled quality it got when she was deciding between anger and pragmatism and had not yet settled on which was more useful. Owen told her he had done what anyone with the same knowledge would have done, And Rowan said that was exactly the problem. He kept assuming everyone operated from the same baseline of decency he did, and the evidence suggested otherwise. She asked if he knew that their grandfather's name had been spoken at a gala attended by the most powerful people in the medical transportation industry, and Owen said he had not had time to answer before the ambulance left. At Bellwether General, Evelyn was propped against pillows in a private room stocked with better flowers than most people kept in their homes, doing the kind of thinking that serious illness forces on people who have spent decades avoiding it. She asked a nurse to bring her a specific telephone number from a list she kept folded in her wallet, and when the call connected, she spoke for 4 minutes to Audrey Winslow, a governance attorney retained for purposes that had nothing to do with Whitmore's official legal team, and told her to bring everything that had been kept in sealed storage. The container Audrey brought the next morning was a compact, fireproof case holding records of a decision made decades ago that Evelyn had told herself was temporary, then necessary, then simply part of the past, and she watched Audrey lay out the documents and confirmed, using a scanned copy of Owen's original employment application and the handwriting on an engineering brief she had kept since the company's earliest years, that the man who had knelt beside her on a hotel ballroom floor was the son of Daniel Hale. She told Audrey she had waited too long and nearly not long enough, and Audrey said courts would not care about the metaphysics of timing, only the documentation, and the documentation was complete. Meanwhile, Celeste had signed the suspension order without fully reading Gideon's reasoning, trusting that he was managing what he called a minor communications liability, intending to thank Owen privately once the noise passed. She would later count this as one of the most expensive assumptions she had ever made. Gideon learned through informal contact with the hospital's administrative staff that Evelyn had requested sealed corporate archives, and he walked into Celeste's office that afternoon to recommend. In the smooth, reasonable tone he used for recommendations he intended to be understood as instructions that all board sessions be postponed until Evelyn had made a full recovery, citing medical best practices and the importance of ensuring no decisions were made under emotional duress. Celeste agreed. She also, for the first time, found herself studying Gideon's face instead of listening to his words, and what she saw when she separated the two did not entirely reassure her. Owen received the formal summons 3 days later, a printed document from the board secretary requesting his presence at a special session on the 62nd floor, no agenda listed, no explanation provided, and he stood in his kitchen for a long time looking at it before he decided that not going would be the only choice he would actually regret. The elevator opened onto a floor that Owen had never accessed, and the conference room was designed to make visitors feel small by giving them too much space. A long table that ran 20 feet under pendant lights, positioned to illuminate the faces of the seated while leaving the walls in shadow. Gideon sat at Celeste's right hand with a folder in front of him and the expression of a man performing patience. 6 board members occupied chairs along the far side, some with laptops open, some with the studied blankness of people who had learned to conceal their conclusions until the vote. A document that Owen recognized as a termination agreement had been placed at the near end of the table, in the seat where a guest would be invited to sit. Celeste opened by thanking Owen for his actions at the gala. The thanks was brief, calibrated, delivered with the slight forward lean she used in presentations to convey sincerity without vulnerability, and then said that gratitude for a personal act could not override the company's obligation to maintain consistent operational standards. That his intervention, however well-intentioned, had created an irregular chain of events the board had a responsibility to address formally. The door opened before Owen could respond. Evelyn Whitmore entered in a wheelchair pushed by Audrey Winslow, who was carrying a document case that she set on the table with the deliberate placement of someone who had decided in advance exactly where it needed to land. Evelyn's doctor followed and positioned himself near the wall, not because anyone had asked him to, but because his presence served as a living counter-argument to any future claim that his patient had not been of sound mind. Evelyn's face showed the asymmetry of recent neurological injury on the left side, but her eyes were fully present, and her voice, when she spoke, carried the resonance of a woman who had built something worth speaking about. She told the room that Whitmore Emergency Mobility had not been founded by a single family, that Daniel Hale had designed the foundational emergency coordinations system that every Whitmore vehicle still used as its operational backbone had contributed the system as equity rather than wages, and in exchange had been granted 18% of voting rights through an instrument called the Hale-Whitmore Founding Trust. She said that after Daniel's death, the trust had been administratively obscured but never legally dissolved, and that its terms required transfer of voting rights to Daniel's direct heir upon verified identification. She looked at Owen across the table with something that was not quite apology and not quite relief, but occupied the space between the two. Audrey distributed document packets. Gideon's protest that Evelyn's medical condition compromised her judgment and that no significant governance action should be taken without independent psychiatric evaluation was met by the doctor near the wall, who produced a cognitive assessment completed 4 hours earlier and spoke 3 sentences in the flat, confident register of someone who had answered this exact challenge before. The room went quiet. Celeste had not moved. Evelyn said that the man they had summoned to terminate was currently in possession of sufficient voting authority to determine the future of Aegis I, and she was simultaneously appointing him chairman of an independent safety commission with authority over all new emergency products prior to public launch. She folded her hands in her lap and said nothing further. Owen sat at the end of the table with the termination document still in front of him and did not feel like a man who had won anything. He felt like a man standing at the edge of the same territory where his father had once stood and lost, trying to determine whether the terrain had changed enough to matter. When the meeting adjourned and the board members filed out in the particular silence of people recalibrating their positions, Gideon passed Owen's chair and dropped his voice to a tone that was not quite a threat and not quite advice. He said that authority on paper did not guarantee survival in the room. An hour later, an encrypted file appeared on Owen's personal phone from an anonymous sender with a subject line that read, Aegis I, the tests they did not want you to see. The files contained 47 simulation reports spanning 18 months of closed testing, and Owen read them at his kitchen table after midnight with the focused attention of someone who understood the vocabulary of the documents and found the gap between what they said and what they were supposed to say immediately legible. Aegis I had been tested across a range of conditions reflecting the real operating environment of emergency response. Urban grid traffic, GPS signal dropout, flooded underpasses, rural routes with no cellular coverage, hospital approach corridors with construction detours, and in a meaningful subset of those simulations, The system had failed to select the correct route within the response window that the company's own engineers had designated as the safety threshold. In one documented scenario, the vehicle's routing algorithm had chosen a shorter distance path that was blocked by a temporary construction closure, and the resulting delay had added 11 minutes to the approach time. And 11 minutes is not an abstraction when the person waiting is in cardiac arrest. The most revealing detail was not the failure rate itself, but what had been done with the failures afterward. Reports initially classified as critical had been reclassified to non-operational impact in a revision cycle occurring over a single weekend, with no engineering sign-off listed and no explanation appended. Celeste arrived at Owen's building the following evening without announcing herself, dressed for a workday that had not ended, and she sat across from him and made an argument she had clearly been constructing for some time. That Aegis 1 represented a technology at the stage where every advanced system required iterative correction in real-world deployment. That the classification revisions reflected the engineering team's judgment about which failures were architectural and which were environmental edge cases, and that a phased rollout would allow the company to collect the field data needed to address residual issues. Owen put the simulation report for the 11-minute routing failure on the table between them and said that an emergency vehicle was not a consumer application that could be patched after the complaints arrived. That the person in the back of the vehicle did not have a support ticket option and did not get a refund if the system miscalculated. Celeste pressed, and Owen sat with the discomfort of the room until she stopped pressing, and the silence acknowledged what she had actually come to hear. She said he was using his new position to punish Whitmore for what had happened to his father. Owen said he had not yet learned the full story of what had happened to his father, and the conversation ended without resolution. But Celeste did not leave immediately. She sat in the chair, looking at the report, not deflecting, and the fact of her remaining registered with Owen as something he had not expected from her. Gideon moved the same evening, delivering to 3 board members and 2 financial journalists a narrative in which Owen Hale was described as a disgruntled hourly employee who had leveraged a medical emergency to position himself for a financial claim against a company he had no legitimate stake in. The story spread through the investment community with the efficiency of information that confirms what anxious people already suspect, and Whitmore's share price began its decline before the trading day was half over. That same night, a structural engineer named Nathan Doyle received a termination notice by email at 10:43 in the evening, and by 11 o'clock the testing archive he had maintained on a personal external drive had been remotely wiped by a system he had not been told was monitoring his access. Owen had not been back to the house where he grew up in 11 years, and the shed at the back of the lot still carried the padlock that Daniel Hale had installed in the final year of his life, with the key that Owen had kept on his ring, for reasons he had never examined closely. The lock opened on the 3rd attempt. The interior was cool and smelled of paper and old wood and the particular quality of things preserved by being ignored. The drawer that Daniel had sealed with a secondary internal lock yielded to the multi-tool Owen carried in his jacket pocket and held inside it 3 notebooks in his father's handwriting, a set of cassette tapes labeled by date, and a folded copy of what appeared to be the original articles of organization for the company that would become Whitmore Emergency Mobility. Owen carried everything to his car and read by dome light. Daniel Hale had not left Whitmore, because his ideas ran dry or his performance declined. He had left because he had discovered, during the negotiation for the city's first major emergency services contract, that Charles Whitmore had authorized the removal of redundant safety layers from the coordination system architecture to reduce the per-unit manufacturing cost by a figure that would make the company's bid competitive at the expense of the protection that prevented a signal failure from producing a routing collapse. Daniel had formally objected, and Charles had escalated the objection into a performance review, the review into a legal threat, and the threat into a settlement agreement that traded Daniel's silence for a severance that paid off one debt and left two others, along with a release of all claims except for the trust that Charles's lawyers had apparently dismissed as unenforceable. Evelyn had known, not the full architecture of what Charles had done, but enough to understand that Daniel's departure had not been mutual and that the founding story had been edited in ways that served the surviving partner. She had stayed silent because the company was fragile and because she had believed, with the conviction of someone who needs to believe it, that the damage was bounded. The last tape in the set was dated 14 months before Daniel's death, and what it said was not directed at Owen specifically. The recording predated any certainty that Owen would ever find it, but the message landed with the directness of something intended. Daniel said that if these materials were ever found, the person who found them should understand that the point of the trust was not to give any individual power over the company, but to ensure that the company could never again make a unilateral decision to trade safety for margin without someone who held the original purpose being present to object, and that purpose was not a family name or a legal instrument. It was the recognition that every piece of equipment Whitmore built would eventually carry someone who was not thinking about corporate governance, someone who was simply counting on the machine to work. Owen sat in the car for a long time after the tape ended. Celeste had also been reviewing records, and when she found her own father's signature on the instruments that had transferred Daniel's intellectual property into the Whitmore corporate estate, she confronted Evelyn directly. Evelyn did not deny what Charles had done and did not attempt to minimize the scale of the omission. She said she had been a coward once, and she asked Celeste whether she recognized the same cowardice in herself, whether choosing to trust Gideon over the engineers who had been raising concerns for 18 months was a different version of the same calculation. Celeste did not have an answer she was proud of. Evelyn said she had not given Owen power over the company to punish Celeste. She had given it to him because saving a life in a hotel ballroom was the kind of act that reminded her why Daniel had built the original system in the first place. The following morning, Audrey confirmed what Owen had already begun to suspect. Gideon had prepared Aegis 1's safety certification using a forged version of Owen's digital signature. Gideon's campaign operated on a principle that media pressure respects above most things. A story that moves fast enough cannot be checked fast enough to stop it. The documents he delivered to selected contacts described a formal request purportedly initiated by Owen for an executive committee seat, a seven-figure consulting agreement, and majority oversight authority over Aegis 1's commercial deployment, all framed as conditions Owen had allegedly demanded in exchange for his signature, and the documents bore his digital signature in the metadata, at a timestamp that placed the request firmly in the window between the boardroom meeting and the share price decline. 3 separate outlets ran the story within a single news cycle under variations of the same framing. that a formerly unknown employee had used a family medical event as leverage to extract financial concessions from a publicly traded corporation. Owen's neighbors were not hostile, but they were uncertain, and uncertainty in a building of people living close together tends to manifest as avoidance. Doors that close a half-second faster, elevator buttons pressed with more focus than the destination requires. His landlord left a politely worded message that said nothing explicit but communicated clearly that the presence of television cameras in the lobby had created concerns the building board found difficult to characterize as neutral. Rowan called from Chicago in a state of precise, articulate fury and told him she had identified dozens of accounts spreading the consulting deal story, most with no posting history prior to the previous 72 hours. Owen told her not to release the Daniel Hale documents yet, and Rowan said that the entire story of their grandfather's erasure from the company's history was sitting in a shed, and they were choosing to say nothing, while Gideon turned her father into a headline. Owen said that if the first move was emotional, Gideon would absorb it and redirect it, turn a legitimate injustice into a family grievance, turn a grievance into a dispute over money, and turn a dispute over money into the story he had already started telling, and the documents needed to come out in a room where they could not be dismissed. Audrey confirmed within 24 hours that the digital signature on the fabricated demand letter was forensically inconsistent. The metadata timestamp did not correspond to any device access log associated with Owen's known hardware, and the formatting conventions matched templates used internally by the executive operations team. But proving forgery required the server logs that recorded who had accessed Owen's personnel file, and those logs were controlled by the same administrative system that Gideon's team managed. Celeste came to Owen with a proposal she did not phrase as a concession. She wanted to conduct an unannounced field test of Aegis 1 under conditions that had not been pre-optimized, no communications staff, no preset route, no performance window designed to make the system look better than it was. The vehicle performed as designed through the first 40 minutes. Urban streets, managed intersections, a hospital approach corridor, and Celeste watched the interface with the attention of someone finally reading a contract she had previously trusted others to summarize. The breakdown came when the route passed through a rail underpass where the cellular signal collapsed, and the GPS feed dropped to 0 for 40 seconds. The system held its last confirmed position rather than engaging the backup routing module, and the vehicle began drifting toward a closed maintenance lane before Owen reached across and engaged manual override, adding 6 minutes to the run. Celeste sat in the passenger seat in the silence that follows an argument one person has been having with themselves for longer than they admitted. She asked Owen why he had not simply allowed the company to collapse under the weight of its own failures and walked away with what was legally his, and Owen said that the people who rode in the back of vehicles like this one did not know or care who owned the company. They had one requirement, that the machine work, and that seemed like a good enough reason to make sure it did. Something shifted in how Celeste looked at him after that, and it was not the look of a CEO assessing a liability or a woman managing a complicated alliance. It was the look of someone who had met a fixed point and was quietly reorienting around it. The alert that Evelyn Whitmore had left her room at Bellwether General moved through the hospital's administrative system at 11:15 at night, and by 11:30 it had reached Celeste's phone. Evelyn's IV port had been carefully capped before her departure, indicating planning rather than disorientation, and her phone was found on the seat of a vehicle registered to the Executive Car Service that Gideon Blackwell used for his private appointments, not because she had lost it there, but because whoever had last used that vehicle had entered the recovery suite without authorization and left a physical trace that Evelyn, with the situational awareness of a woman who had spent her life in rooms where agendas were concealed behind pleasantries, had recognized and documented before she left. She had gone to a private residence belonging to her personal attorney, bringing the document case and a recorder and a notary Audrey had arranged, and she called Audrey from the landline to confirm arrival, and Audrey relayed word to Celeste, who relayed it to Owen at midnight with a message that said simply, "She's safe, and she's working." The phone in Gideon's car complicated things without resolving them. Sufficient evidence of unauthorized access, but not the direct documentation that would hold in a governance proceeding without server logs to anchor it. Owen and Celeste spent the next day operating in careful parallel. Celeste used her executive credentials to issue a data preservation order covering the Whitmore server infrastructure, citing an internal compliance review, while Owen filed a formal request through the Hale Whitmore Trust to postpone the Aegis 1 launch vote pending a safety review. Together, the two actions created a legal holding pattern that bought time without requiring either of them to reveal the full hand they were holding. Nathan Doyle agreed to meet Owen at a diner in the Eastgate neighborhood on a Tuesday morning, and he confirmed that the reclassification of critical testing failures had been directed by Gideon in two separate meetings, that the engineering team's formal objections had been removed from the project's documentation archive, and that Gideon had offered him a structured severance payment in exchange for a non-disclosure agreement he had declined to sign. Owen told him those notes needed to be in Audrey's hands by end of day. Celeste, reviewing the paper trail that Audrey's team had begun to reconstruct from the preserved server data, found the pattern Nathan's account described: approvals bearing her digital signature on documents bundled into large administrative packets that she had cleared during weeks of 18-hour days. When reading everything in detail was a discipline that had slipped in favor of trusting the people she had hired to have already read it. Owen did not soften what he said about this when she brought it up. He said that signing things you had not read did not transfer the consequences to the people who prepared them, and she accepted this without deflection, which told him something about who she was becoming under pressure that was different from who she had been when he first met her. They were working side by side in the engineering review suite past midnight when she noticed the watch he wore. Plain, older than his suit, clearly not chosen for its value, and asked about it. And Owen said it had belonged to his wife, and she did not ask anything further. And the quality of the silence after that exchange was different from the silences that had preceded it, and both of them noticed without remarking on it. The plan to expose Gideon required giving him a surface to perform on, a board session where he believed he held the decisive votes and was not yet aware that the foundation beneath them had been replaced. The emergency board session was called for a Thursday morning, and Gideon arrived with the composed, proprietary confidence of a man who had counted heads and found the math in his favor. He opened by presenting Owen's position as a structural conflict of interest, a trust beneficiary attempting to block a commercial project in a manner that would benefit competing interests, and described Celeste's conduct over the previous week as evidence of compromised judgment, an unauthorized field test, proprietary data shared with an external party, and a failure to take decisive action when the company's launch timeline was under attack from within. He proposed his own appointment as acting chief executive, effective immediately pending a 60-day governance review, and presented the fabricated demand letter bearing Owen's digital signature as proof of bad faith negotiation by a party who had used personal proximity to a medical emergency to manufacture a claim against a company he had no legitimate stake in. Owen asked, in a tone that carried none of the urgency of someone buying time and all the patience of someone who had already found the answer, whether the board would consent to reviewing the server logs that would clarify the signature's origin. Gideon said the relevant server data had been compromised in a system migration incident earlier that week and expressed regret, and told the board to proceed on the basis of available documentation. Celeste said that Whitmore Emergency Mobility had a secondary archive server, an offline redundancy system built into the infrastructure during the company's founding years as a failsafe against exactly the kind of centralized data loss that had just been described. And Audrey produced authorization codes that had been part of the trust documentation and had never been transferred to the executive operations system that Gideon managed. The offline server's logs were read into the record. Gideon's administrative credentials appeared 6 times in Owen's personnel file over a period of 4 days. Owen's digital signature had been accessed and replicated using an executive system tool. The testing classification revisions bore revision tags consistent with Gideon's access periods. Nathan Doyle was brought in from the anteroom to provide direct testimony recorded formally for the legal record, and Audrey then produced documentation establishing that Gideon held an undisclosed equity position in Mercer Systems Incorporated, the third-party maintenance contractor positioned to receive the primary service contract for Aegis One's government deployment, a financial interest that had not been disclosed to the board at the time the project was approved and constituted a breach of the conflict of interest provisions in his executive agreement. Gideon attempted to reframe each disclosure as mischaracterized, then context-dependent, and finally as a matter best handled by standard review rather than in a governance meeting convened without proper notice. Celeste said that the board deserved to understand the full extent of what had been approved under her tenure, and that she accepted personal responsibility for having operated without sufficient oversight of the decisions made in her name. Said it not as a negotiation but as a factual correction of the record, and several members who had been prepared to support Gideon's motion found themselves recalculating in real time what it meant that she had said it unprompted. Owen exercised the 18% voting authority of the Hale Whitmore Founding Trust to block the Aegis One launch and suspend Gideon Blackwell's executive authority pending a formal investigation. The motion passed with 5 votes in favor. Gideon stood from his chair, straightened his jacket, and told the room that the company had 72 hours before the government contract office activated its cancellation clause for failure to meet the launch milestone. 72 hours is a precise and unforgiving unit of time, and Owen spent the first 4 of them in a conversation with Celeste in the engineering suite that was less a negotiation than a collective decision to act, as though the outcome were already possible, and work backward from there. He did not want to destroy the company. It had been built on work his father had done, and the fact that his father's name had been removed from the founding record did not change the nature of what had been built. What Gideon had done to Aegis One was not the company's original failure. It was the recurrence of a pattern that the original trust had been created specifically to interrupt. Owen proposed to the full engineering team, including 3 members effectively sidelined for the past 18 months under Gideon's management structure, that the core safety flaw in Aegis 1 was not distributed throughout the vehicle's architecture, but isolated in a single design decision. The removal of a redundant offline routing module that Daniel Hale's original coordination framework had treated as non-negotiable, authorized by Gideon 18 months earlier to reduce the per-unit manufacturing cost by an amount that looked significant in a quarterly report and was negligible compared to the liability exposure of a routing failure in a deployed emergency vehicle. The module specifications were still in the design archive, and rebuilding and integrating it was not a reinvention but a restoration. Rowan arrived from Chicago on the second day, carrying digitized versions of Daniel's notebooks that she had spent the previous week converting from physical scans into workable engineering references, and she moved through the suite with the focused efficiency of someone who had inherited her grandfather's disposition toward problems that require patience rather than force, handed off the relevant files to the lead engineer, and stepped back. The corrected module integrated cleanly with Aegis 1's existing software at the level Owen had predicted. The failure had always been a removal, not a limitation, and restoration required precision rather than innovation. By the evening of the second day, the vehicle was ready for the final verification run, and Celeste arranged for the government contract representative, a deputy director from the Federal Emergency Services Office named Patricia Caldwell, to attend in person rather than receiving a written report. The test took place on a route Patricia Caldwell selected the morning of the run, without advance notice to anyone at Whitmore. Rain began 40 minutes in. The vehicle navigated the first 2 signal dropout zones using the restored backup module without breaking stride, and in the third zone, a stretch beneath an elevated rail line where cellular coverage was functionally zero. The system identified the navigation gap, engaged the offline map cache, and maintained its route within the response threshold. Owen sat in the monitoring position in the follow vehicle and watched the data feed without speaking for the duration of the tunnel segment. When Aegis 1 emerged from the underpass on schedule, Celeste, seated beside Patricia Caldwell in the observation vehicle, exhaled without apparent self-consciousness. Patricia Caldwell agreed to recommend contract continuation with a modification requiring that the Whitmore Independent Safety Commission maintain certification authority over all future Aegis 1 variants, with Owen Hale as commission chair, and the agreement was formalized in writing before anyone left the staging facility. 3 days later, at a press event in the Whitmore atrium, Evelyn appeared before cameras for the first time since the gala and apologized to the family of Daniel Hale by name, confirmed his status as a legal co-founder of the company, and announced that the Hale-Whitmore Founding Trust would be restructured from a private instrument of succession into a permanent institutional oversight mechanism, a standing check on the company's safety obligations, owned by no individual and answerable only to the mission that had produced it. Owen declined the private financial settlement Whitmore's legal team had prepared. He accepted only the assets legally attributable to his father's stake and directed the remainder into a foundation that would fund emergency response training in communities whose infrastructure had never attracted the kind of investment that well-resourced cities took for granted. 6 months passed, and the Whitmore emergency mobility that emerged from them was not the same institution that had held its 40th anniversary gala in the Grand Meridian's ballroom. The governance changes were structural: a separated safety division, an independent audit cycle, a board composition requirement reserving 2 seats for professionals whose background was in emergency services rather than investment. Gideon Blackwell faced charges filed by the Federal Contracting Office and the State Attorney General covering fraud, falsification of safety records, and undisclosed financial conflicts, a process that moved with the deliberate, unglamorous pace of institutional accountability and did not require violence or spectacle to carry weight. Celeste retained the chief executive position after a confidence vote by the reconstituted board, and the version of her that walked into that vote was perceptibly different from the version that had sat across a conference table from Owen with a termination agreement and the residual authority of someone who had never been seriously challenged. She had separated the safety certification function from her direct authority, voluntarily reducing her own power in the area where Gideon had found the most space to work, which board members who understood governance recognized as the hardest kind of structural change to make. Owen kept his apartment and his schedule. He took the title of permanent chairman of the Hale-Whitmore Safety Commission and set up his working office not in the tower, but in a converted training facility in the warehouse district, eventually expanded into the Daniel Hale Emergency Response Center, a full training program for field paramedics and emergency vehicle operators from the counties surrounding Bellwether, places where the infrastructure gap between urban response capacity and rural response capacity was wide enough to measure in lives. Rowan completed her degree and chose a design firm in Minneapolis that worked on public access systems rather than joining any initiative connected to the family settlement, which told Owen more about the health of their household than any conversation could have. Evelyn came to the training center on a morning in late autumn with no announcement and no photographers, spent several hours talking with the program's first cohort of students, not as a philanthropist performing generosity, but as someone repaying a debt that had been compounding for decades, and understood that the payment was overdue enough to require more than a check. She asked questions more than she answered them, and the quality of her listening was the quality of a person who had finally stopped managing her own legacy and started attending to something larger. The launch event for the production version of Aegis 1 included a dedication ceremony at which Evelyn made the second public announcement that Owen had been present for, this time from a podium rather than a wheelchair, delivered without hesitation. She named Daniel Hale as the forgotten architect of everything Whitmore had built, and she introduced Owen as the man who had saved the company twice, once by recognizing what was happening to her body on a hotel ballroom floor when everyone else looked away, and once by recognizing what was happening to the company's soul when everyone else was prepared to let it continue. After the event, Celeste found Owen on the rooftop terrace, where the lights of Bellwether were laid out below in the patient geometry of a city that had been carrying on regardless. She asked if he still thought of her as the person who had been prepared to trade safety for a timeline, and he said that she had been that person, and that being that person in the past did not determine who she chose to be from here. She asked him to dinner, not to discuss the commission, or the trust, or the pending litigation, but simply to have a meal. And he smiled and said yes, and they went down together to where the rest of the evening was waiting. Later, standing alone in the Whitmore atrium before the new honor wall, Owen looked at the photograph placed there, his father's face beside Evelyn's and Celeste's, with a line beneath it that said, "The man had not built the machine to make one family wealthy, but to bring every family safely home." He reached up and straightened the frame by a small degree, the way a person adjusts something that belongs to them, then walked back out into the light that had first revealed him. A man standing still in a room full of power, watching someone in need of the one person who knew exactly what to do.